And also that traffic undoes most of whatever enlightenment I might get out of this.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, also interested in kind of things about the Tibet practice.
Which one?
The Houston Heights.
I almost went last weekend,
Yeah.
but I've never been there before.
I mean, it's funny. I only went their classes. I never actually Sunday morning stay away outside of the events. But yeah, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's Smithers and they're very established. They have a lot of they're great. Yeah.
So what are the Tuesday meets like? Is it really be there on the topic?
There are specific classes like last when I was there, it was so I think we're doing one of the inline
So Shane, it's 10:30. Are we ready to go? We are ready. Good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me. Is this okay, Shane? Yeah. So we're doing something a little bit different for the next 6 weeks. Aside from the first weekend in October, when we have the last weekend of September, the 1st of October, the September 29th, we have a retreat that weekend. But on Sundays, we will be doing a half-hour lecture on introducing Buddhism. We will, to some extent, be using this book. It's called Discovering Buddhism by Dominique Seed. It's recommended by Dzogchen Khyentse Rinpoche. Both Lama Rigdzin and myself, I am Lama Namgyal, Harvey Aronson. We both have PhDs in Buddhist studies, so we're not relying on just one book. It's kind of a lifetime of study at this point. It's perhaps a little bit hard for us to appreciate what people don't know about Buddhism. I myself got attracted in 1964, which at this point is quite ancient history. And what attracted me was talk about calming the mind and universal love. And that still attracts me. And over the years, I have become aware that there is a lot more in Buddhism, and over the course of our teachings, we hope to share with you what some of that more is all about. It's probably important in terms of understanding Buddhism to understand a little bit about where it came from culturally and historically. One of my reigning heroes is a cultural psychologist named Richard Schwader, who teaches cultural psychology at University of Chicago. He's an anthropologist. And he talks about really coming to know another culture, and that the first thing that we do in coming to interact with another culture is thinking through that culture. And by that he means coming to appreciate that they, in another culture or another religion, frankly, it's often another person, they see aspects of human life and human experience that may be underrepresented in our own culture. There are aspects of life that are underrepresented in another culture, another religion, that open up to us aspects of life that we may otherwise be missing if we don't really come into contact with that culture. And hopefully, as we proceed even today, with a bit of an introduction, we'll begin to see that there are some aspects of life you may or may not believe what you hear or see life the way that some of the traditional Buddhists and traditional Indians were contending with, but at least opens a possibility of seeing things differently. Most people nowadays don't look at original sources for Buddhist teachings, but if you do, it will be helpful to understand some of the key concepts that we'll begin to be talking about in these lectures. Because just as somebody thinking about today would need to know the phrase TikTok, we perhaps need to understand Brahma, the god Brahma in ancient India. It's just a minor example, but the language of religion will be couched in the language of the time and the place. So when did it all begin and where? Buddha was born in southern Nepal, and his ministry, if we like to call it that, took place in northeastern India, mostly in the states which today are called Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. Major cities that he was around were certainly Benares, Bodh Gaya, and others. And he would have been walking those areas. You know, we've been to these places, and actually, if you start thinking about walking, the kind of long distances that he traversed. When did the Buddha live? Probably a fair amount of debate around that, but scholars settled, at least when I was in graduate school, on 563 BC to 483 BC. So that's well before the Christian era. 563 BC to 483 BC. He lived about 80 years, which at that time was probably a pretty hefty life to live 80. It's a healthy lifespan. And at the time that he lived and taught, there were several interesting and important threads of spirituality and religion occurring all over India. Around 1500 BC, and these dates will be hotly debated, but about 1500 BC, there was an invasion by what are called Aryan invaders. And these people came from the northwest, and I found this interesting when I started studying the languages of India. The Aryan invaders actually went everywhere from Ireland, which is related to Aryan, to Iran. And in India, they use the word Arya. I guess those of us who are old enough to remember or read about World War II, in Nazi Germany, they took this word Aryan and it related it to the German race, who were considered Aryans, we say in English, pure, blonde, blue eyes. It's not what the Aryans look like in India. But it turns out the languages from Sanskrit and Hindi in India to all the way to Ireland, most of what are called the Indo-European languages are kissing cousins. So in India, a cow is a go, and a hand is a hasta, a tooth, we go to the dentist, is a danta. Many, many cognate related words. Many, of course, not, but there are many cultural elements that are shared between all the way North India for sure, out into Ireland. So the language of the Aryans was Vedic, which evolved into Sanskrit, which was a kind of high language, ultimately. And the religion of the Aryans was one of sacrifice, where you would sacrifice animals for particular gains, whether it be power, wealth, good weather. Most interestingly, and very, very different from us, is they had a class system, which became the caste system in India, where the priests were the highest, then there was the army people, then there was farmers and merchants, and then the servant class. And very, very different from the modern West is where you were born was where you ended up. If you were born a priest, you were a priest, and you married a priestess. And that system became incredibly oppressive and rigidified, and included the lower class, included what would be called in English untouchables eventually. And it was as oppressive in its own way as any forms of slavery that we encountered in our history here in the modern West. The untouchables, you couldn't, high caste Indian could not touch an untouchable. That was considered polluting. And it was the case that you wouldn't even want the shadow of an untouchable to cross your food, because it was polluting. And of course, relationships and marriages between castes were no-no. And I go into that a little bit because one of the remarkable things about Buddhism is that it didn't buy into the caste system. So closer to the time of the Buddha, there was a lot of religious ferment. And a body of teachings occurred which were called the Upanishads. And these were highly speculative and metaphysical teachings that moved away from the whole sacrificial vision of religious and spiritual life, and were much more internalized and personal and related to coming into contact with the inner nature of the individual, which somehow was related to a universal nature. In Indian terms, they would be talking about Atman, or the soul was related to a universal soul, which was called Brahman. Brahman, in that instance, is a neuter term. It's, in Sanskrit terms, are masculine, feminine, or neuter. But there was also a very, very interesting development that goes on to this very day, where there were people who would drop out of organized society and they would wander and beg, and they would be investigating spiritual, religious issues. It was very, very dynamic. If we read the early Buddhist scriptures, there are all sorts of views that are being put forth. There are all sorts of practices that were being practiced. Why were they doing this? Well, somewhere in this era, there certainly was the idea of rebirth, that individuals were reborn, and that in Sanskrit called samsara, which is a word that certainly has moved into the English language. I think there are perfumes that are called samsara or whatever. Probably also perfumes called nirvana. But there was this notion that not only would there be hardships in this life, but guess what? When you die, you come back and it's just more hardships. And this was felt and experienced to be very, very painful. And what was desired was liberation. In Sanskrit, the word is moksha, freedom. There are a lot of different views that were being bandied about. There were some people clearly who were what we call today materialists and kind of nihilists, and that was, these were people who believed that you lived life, you died, and boom, poof, nada, gone. And there are many certainly today who believe similarly. You live life, you die, and nada. So that was one school of thought. There were a lot of interesting, what are called ascetic practices that people were using to try to become free. Fasting, yogic practices. It seems from what archaeologists find, the practices where Brett sitting like that, you'll see some ancient statues which predate the Aryans, seem to indicate that yoga was probably present in India pre-Aryan. And so there would be physical practices, sitting cross-legged with your legs in a particular posture. But why stop there? Sitting on your head, standing on your head, learning how to move your stomach muscles this away and that away, reversing the kind of vital energies of the body with practices related to the breathing. Fasting was very, very popular, and if we read the story of Gautama, who eventually became a wanderer, there is a kind of lovely form of extreme rhetoric in the tradition. So he talks about how he tried ascetic practices, getting down to, I think, eating like 1 grain of rice a day. And if you look at a book on Buddhist art, there's usually a picture of what looks like a skeletal structure just covered with a very, very thin layer of skin. And in the text, it's kind of funny because Gautama is quoted as saying, well, when I went to scratch my stomach, I was scratching my backbone. And when I was going to scratch my backbone, I was scratching my stomach because there's just no meat there whatsoever. So it was a wide ferment. It was probably the period that those of you who are interested in yoga, the core teachings of yoga are called the Yoga Sutras. It's probably about when the Yoga Sutras were formed. The teachings of the Upanishads were probably coalescing at the same time. There was another religion in India that grew up at this period that called Jainism. It's a fabulous religion. Jainism did not become an export religion. Yeah, and just in passing, it's worth noting that probably one of the world's first missionary religions was Buddhism. Buddha explicitly told his followers, go out into the world and teach. And so it became exported. But many of the religions and practices of India stayed in India, and Jainism was one of them. It was really, really at the very same time, and some of the language of Buddhism and Jainism were highly intermixed. In Jainism, the thought was that any action, even if unintended, would kind of darken your soul. And really, some of the heights of Jain practice were basically just shutting down because action was so dangerous. But it lives on. It's a completely nonviolent religion. And in Jainism, everything, including inanimate objects, are considered to have a soul. So you can't really harm anything. And it's a very, very interesting position. And in the early scriptures, there's certainly times when Gautama is seen as taking on that doctrine and kind of debating with it. So it's into this kind of world that Gautama is born. And it seems that it was a period when cities were growing larger. I mean, India is an agrarian economy and still is, but at that time, cities were beginning to develop. The kind of culture he grew up in, it was royal, but I think there was probably some democratic principles involved in the way things were governed as well. He's born into a princely family, and he is a prince, and as was the nature of things in those days, when he was born, his father had the soothsayers, the prophets, the fortune tellers come and foretell the future of the young son. His name was Siddhartha. Siddhartha literally means one whose aims have been accomplished. And so the fortune was he will either be a great king or a religious leader. And the father, being kind of standard issue, king, you can imagine, my son, the religious leader? You got to be kidding. I want him to be a king. So the father devised, I mean, it's got mythic dimensions, but it has a lot of meaning to it as well. A strategy to keep his son isolated from anything that might lead him to turn his mind to religion. So nothing negative was supposed to be coming across this young prince's life experience. Dare we say lots of luck? But apparently they were fairly successful. Married, had a child. But the way the story goes is he was very, very curious and eventually convinced his charioteer to take him out on some excursions outside the confines of the palace where everything was perfect. And the first vision that shocked the young prince was to see an old person. He hadn't seen any old people. It's hard to believe, but hadn't seen any old people. It was shocking. What is that? That is old age. Second excursion, saw somebody who was obviously sick, in the good old days in India. At least when we were there, maybe it was probably there at the same time, a lot of leprosy. So if you see someone with leprosy, it's really evident there's something dramatically wrong, as they lose their fingers and lose parts of their bodies. So a sick person, what's that? Asking the charioteer, oh, that's sickness. Everyone is subject to sickness. Everyone is subject to old age. Okay, back to the palace. Third excursion. I see a body being carried for cremation. Very common in India. 2 poles and with the body wrapped up in cloth, going to the banks of the Ganges or somewhere to be burned. What's that? That's a dead person. Oh my God. Everyone is subject to death, the charioteer informs him. Very, very upsetting. Old age, sickness, and death. And then on the 4th trip, they see someone walking very settled, very calm, serene. Maybe the person had a begging bowl. It's one of these wandering ascetics. Who's that? Oh, that's someone who's dedicated their life to becoming free from old age, sickness, and death, and the wheel of repetitive rebirth, karma and samsara. Oh, the young prince, I want some of that. So the cliffhanger is, he convinces his charioteer to help him escape from the palace. He cuts off his hair. He, of course, gets rid of his royal clothing. And somewhere along the line, he dresses himself in what in those days was prisoner garb, orange-colored robes. Nowadays we see, what are they? Green, blue, pink jumpsuits when people are coming in from prison. Well, he basically was wearing the prison jumpsuit of the age with these leftover rags, which were saffron colored, which is what prisoners were wearing. And he decided to dedicate his life to finding an escape from old age, sickness, and death, and the repetitive wheel of rebirth. So I think the takeaways for today are that the young prince became a wanderer and a seeker of a way out of the cycle of painful rebirth, which was a common belief by the time Buddha arose. And he was in a social circumstance where this class caste system was very, very predominant. And he ultimately did not accept that system in his order of religious practitioners. But with that, we'll take a very, very short break. And this will be continued. Next week, Lama Rigdzin will come and teach. Yes. And we'll start our meditation in just a few seconds.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You learned something new?
I did. I did not know about the colored robes being orange as the prison garb. I did not know that. That was something new for me.
Yeah.
Can I ask a really quick question?
Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm skipping ahead, but I've read certain accounts that Gotama was a pretty skillful meditator. Was it after he got out of the...
No, there are stories that in his
He had teachers and he was really a skilled meditation practitioner.
both before he left home and